the buying of time, and Israel waiting to see how it is affected by the possible outcomes.
Israel has drawn a red line on the issue of ballistic missiles, and it's made it known to Iran that if it crosses a certain threshold, we don't know what that threshold is, but we've heard the numbers 2,000 missiles thrown around, which is approximately the number that Iran had on the eve of the June war last year. So whatever happens, the talks continue, they reach a deal or not. Israel has made it clear that it has a threshold. Now, there are many different scenarios potentially going forward. If a deal is struck and there's no written clause about missiles, that raises the questions, will there be some sort of quiet understanding? Will the Americans tell the Iranians, listen, we have a deal on the nuclear issue. If you continue to mass produce ballistic missiles, Israel is going to attack with the backing of the United States. The ball's in your court. Is that an option? Some people think it's realistic. Others think it's less realistic, that the Iranians won't agree to that. We don't know. It's a question mark. If these talks collapse and the United States moves in to strike, well, then Israel is very likely to be dragged in any case, because the Iranians have made it very clear that they're going to fire missiles at Israel as well. Now, if they do that, Israel has a golden opportunity to strike down Iran's missile program. So these are the multiple scenarios that we're looking at here. At the end of the day, Israel is the country that's in charge of monitoring and keeping in check the Iranian missile program. I think President Trump is happy for Israel to be in charge of that aspect of things. And the nuclear program will either be dealt with through these talks, and that's likely to be a very temporary solution, or through an American strike.
Right now, and we see these warships, these strike carriers, making their way to various parts across the Middle East. Does he have a point, realistically?
He can order his forces in the scenario of a breakdown in talks and hostilities erupting. He can target the carriers with missiles, but the chances of those missiles actually hitting their targets is pretty low. These carriers come with multiple air defenses, the most advanced in the world, from missile interceptors that are on board to electronic warfare. They are much more likely to not be able to strike those carriers because the carriers are very capable of defending themselves. And in fact, this is sort of looks like a mouse that's threatening a lion. When we match up the firepower here between the United States and Iran, yes, the Iranians do have asymmetric and missile capabilities. They can fire missiles from the surface. They can fire missiles. They can fire drones, attack drones, and suicide drones. But the Americans have air defenses on board their vessels, from the carrier strike groups all the way down to missile ships. And the offensive firepower here, there's no match whatsoever. So this is, I think a lot of this is grandstanding for the base, the Shiite fundamentalist base that this regime claims to represent. And they want to show that they're not scared. They're going into these negotiations with a firm sort of stance. A lot of this is posturing, I think, for the domestic audience back home, too.
And talking about that domestic audience back at home, specifically the audience inside Iran itself, a hospital has shared more than 75 sets of medical images, including X-rays and CT scans, with The Guardian, explaining that these images were taken over one single evening during the regime's crackdown on anti-regime protesters in January. Now, it's estimated that tens of thousands of demonstrators were brutally murdered during that unrest, but there is still no official death toll at this stage, and it's unlikely that there will be one. And Yaakov Lapin, that brings us to the question of the impact right now, while these talks continue, indirect talks, and there's likely to be potentially another round down the line, what this means for the Iranian people waiting to see how it all unfolds, and asking the question, if the US does in fact strike, how does it actually impact the lives of Iranians right now?
This is the key question, Benito, because we do have a conundrum here, and that is that military power, when we're talking about air power or naval power, in and of itself is not sufficient to bring down a regime. And we don't know of many cases in history where only that has brought down a regime. What you need is somebody on the ground to capitalize on a regime that's hit from the air in order to continue and to topple the centers of power. Right now, we don't have that. We have millions of unarmed Iranians, and they are traumatized sitting at home after the massacre, the crime against humanity that the regime has leveled on them last month in the space of 2 days. And so, the question of how another strike, if it happens, would impact them is totally unclear. What we would want to see is some sort of armed, proper resistance organization in Iran that knows how to function with command and control, go after the nodes of power, convince parts of the Iranian army to defect. If we start seeing something like that on the ground, then the air and naval power starts to make sense as a regime changer. But without that ground presence, airstrikes on their own are not enough, usually, we see in history, to bring a regime down, especially not one the size of Iran, with its vast population and territory. And so this raises the bigger question of what is the goal of the strike? Because if it's regime change, nobody's promising the Trump administration that they're going to achieve that. But if it's to force the Iranians back into negotiations, if they break down, that might happen. This is the issue. We need clarity on what the goal of the strike will be.